Fear has a particular way of arriving. It doesn't knock gently, and it doesn't wait for permission. It tends to appear suddenly, often without a clear external cause, and it brings with it a sense of urgency that feels personal and immediate. When this happens, most people assume the message is obvious. Something must be wrong, something must be unsafe, something must be avoided. That assumption feels so natural that it is rarely questioned. Yet if you slow down and look closely at when fear actually shows up in your life, a pattern begins to emerge. Fear does not consistently arrive at moments of obvious danger. It does not always appear when you are genuinely off course. Instead, it often emerges at moments that are harder to define, moments where nothing outwardly dramatic has happened, yet something inwardly feels unsettled. The fear feels real, but the source feels strangely unclear. This is where confusion begins. The mind looks for an explanation that matches the intensity of the sensation. It scans the future, imagines consequences, constructs scenarios, and attempts to locate a threat that would justify the reaction. The more it searches, the more convincing the fear becomes, but because attention has been fully captured. What often goes unnoticed is that fear does not require an external trigger to activate. It only requires internal change. When the structures that once organized your decisions, motivations, and sense of direction begin to loosen, the nervous system registers instability before the mind understands what is happening. The sensation arrives first, the story follows later. This is why fear can feel deeply personal even when it lacks a clear object. It feels as though it is about your life, your future, your security, but it is not necessarily responding to what is happening around you. It is responding to what is happening within you. Specifically, it responds to the quiet erosion of something familiar that once provided orientation. Most people are never taught to recognize this. They are taught to interpret fear as a warning signal, a call to analyze, correct, or retreat. That interpretation gives fear authority. It positions it as a guide rather than a response. And once fear is granted that role, it begins to dictate behavior without ever needing to explain itself. But there is another way to read what is happening, and it begins with noticing timing rather than content. Fear tends to intensify when old motivations stop working, when previous desires lose their pull, when familiar goals no longer generate the same emotional charge. These moments are rarely celebrated. They are often labeled as confusion, stagnation, or loss of direction. Internally, however, they mark a shift that has already begun. When something inside you starts reorganizing, the systems that depended on the old arrangement react. They attempt to reassert relevance. They generate noise. They demand reassurance. Fear is part of that response. It appears to keep familiar structures in place a little longer. This is why fear can feel louder precisely when nothing seems obviously wrong. The volume does not reflect danger, it reflects resistance. Not resistance to change itself, but resistance to becoming unnecessary. The fear is not speaking about the path ahead, it is speaking from a position that senses it may no longer be central. At this stage, most people try to resolve the fear by understanding it. They analyze it, soothe it, debate with it, or attempt to eliminate it. In doing so, they unintentionally strengthen the very signal they are trying to quiet. Attention becomes fuel. Engagement becomes validation. The fear remains active because it is being treated as meaningful information. What is rarely considered is that fear does not always appear to stop you from doing something. Sometimes it appears because stopping is no longer possible. Something has already shifted beneath conscious awareness, and the fear is a delayed response to that movement. The internal ground has changed, even if the external environment has not yet caught up. This creates a strange experience. You may feel suspended between what no longer fits and what has not yet fully revealed itself. The mind dislikes this space. It prefers clear direction, familiar reference points, and immediate explanations. Fear fills the gap left by uncertainty, offering urgency in place of clarity. For now, only notice one thing. The presence of fear does not automatically mean that something is wrong. Sometimes it means something familiar is loosening its grip. Sometimes it means a structure you once relied on is no longer organizing your experience in the same way. The question is not how to get rid of the fear. The question is whether it is pointing forward or whether it is echoing from something that is already fading. That distinction changes everything, and it sets the stage for what comes next. Because once you see when fear appears, you can begin to understand why trusting the flow requires less energy than responding to the noise. Fear is not a single experience, even though we use one word to describe it. There is a kind of fear that belongs to the body and a kind that belongs to the imagination, and confusing the two is where most internal struggle begins. Your nervous system is designed to respond instantly when your physical safety is threatened. A car swerves, a loud noise erupts nearby, a body moves too close too fast. That fear is immediate, specific, and situational. It rises, it mobilizes you, and once the threat passes, it settles. It does not linger, it does not narrate, it does not ask you to rehearse the next 6 months of your life. The fear we are speaking about here is not that kind of fear. It does not come from the present moment, it comes from an imagined future. It arises not because something is happening to you now, but because you cannot clearly see what is coming next. It is the fear of not knowing what the next version of your life looks like, not knowing how things will resolve, not knowing which identity, role, or direction will replace the one that is quietly losing relevance. This fear feels real because the mind treats uncertainty as a threat. The brain evolved to predict, to anticipate, to maintain continuity. When prediction becomes difficult, the system does not remain neutral. It fills the gap with projections. These projections are not warnings in the traditional sense. They are attempts to restore familiarity. The mind is not trying to harm you. It is trying to return you to what it recognizes. That is why this fear speaks almost exclusively in future language. It asks questions that cannot be answered in the present. What if this doesn't work? What if I regret this? What if I lose something I can't get back? What if I end up worse off than before? None of these questions correspond to a current event. They correspond to imagined outcomes. The fear is not responding to danger, it is responding to uncertainty. What makes this fear especially convincing is that it borrows the intensity of survival fear while lacking its context. The body feels activated, the chest tightens, the breath shortens, the mind speeds up. But there is no immediate action that resolves it. There is no clear threat to move away from. There is no moment where the danger passes. The fear sustains itself because it is being fed by thought rather than circumstance. This is where people exhaust themselves. They treat imagined futures as though they require immediate resolution. They attempt to think their way out of uncertainty. They search for guarantees, reassurance, or perfect plans that will quiet the sensation. But uncertainty cannot be eliminated through prediction. The future does not become safer because it has been rehearsed. It only becomes louder. The crucial distinction here is this: fear tied to physical safety demands action in the present. Fear tied to uncertainty demands certainty about the future. The first protects your body. The second protects an identity that depends on knowing what comes next. When you respond to the second as though it were the first, you pour energy into something that cannot be stabilized through effort. This is why the fear we are discussing tends to appear during transitions, not crises. It shows up when old plans loosen, when familiar motivations fade, when certainty drops away. There is no emergency, yet the internal alarm sounds as though there were one. The system reacts not because you are in danger, but because it cannot predict how you will define yourself next. The mind does not like open-endedness. It prefers closed loops. It prefers narratives with clear beginnings, middles, and ends. When the future feels undefined, the mind fills the space with imagined consequences to restore a sense of structure. Fear becomes the organizing principle. It gives shape to the unknown by populating it with scenarios. This is also why this fear is so sticky. You cannot resolve it by checking your environment. There is nothing to fix, nothing to remove, nothing to defend against. The only thing that would satisfy it is certainty, and certainty is not available during genuine transition. The more you try to extract answers from the future, the more the fear persists. What is rarely acknowledged is that this fear is not actually about the future itself. It is about continuity of self. The question beneath all the what-ifs is simpler and more vulnerable. Who am I if I don't know what comes next? Who am I if the old markers no longer apply? Who am I without the familiar story that used to organize my choices? When that question remains unanswered, fear steps in as a temporary structure. It gives the mind something to hold on to. It creates the illusion of engagement. It keeps the old identity active by insisting that it is still needed to solve a problem. The fear is not pointing forward, it is maintaining relevance backward. This is why responding to this fear feels draining rather than clarifying. You can think about it endlessly and still feel no closer to resolution. You can analyze every possible outcome and still feel unsettled. The energy you are expending is not building anything new, it is preserving something that is already dissolving. At this stage, it is important to be precise. Not all fear should be ignored. Fear that arises in response to immediate physical threat is intelligent and necessary. It belongs to the present moment and resolves through action. The fear we are examining belongs to imagined time. It does not require action, it requires recognition. Once you see this distinction clearly, something subtle shifts. You stop treating uncertainty as an emergency. You stop assuming that discomfort means danger. You begin to notice that the fear intensifies not when something bad is happening, but when something undefined is happening. The sensation remains, but its authority weakens. This is not about suppressing fear or dismissing it. It is about placing it in the correct category. This fear is not asking you to protect your body. It is asking you to protect an outdated sense of self from the discomfort of not knowing what comes next. And protecting it costs more energy than allowing it to fade. As this becomes clearer, a new question naturally emerges. If fear is consuming energy by pointing toward imagined futures, where does energy go when it is not being spent there? What happens when attention is withdrawn from what is not yet real? What begins to surface when the noise quiets, not because it was silenced, but because it was no longer needed? Energy is not abstract. It is not just a feeling or a metaphor. It is attention, physiological activation, mental rehearsal, emotional charge. Where your energy goes, structure follows. This is why the question of fear versus flow is not philosophical. It is practical. One consumes energy without building anything tangible. The other requires very little energy because it follows what is already assembling on its own. The fear rooted in uncertainty survives by pulling energy into imagined time. It keeps you busy managing futures that do not yet exist. You rehearse conversations that have not happened. You brace for outcomes that may never arrive. You problem-solve scenarios that have no current material form. All of this activity feels productive because it is active, but nothing is actually being constructed in the present. The energy circulates internally, never grounding into reality. This is why responding to this kind of fear feels exhausting in a way that physical effort does not. Physical effort produces feedback. You lift something, you move something, you complete something. The energy resolves into form. Fear-based mental activity does not resolve. It loops. It consumes energy while leaving the external world unchanged. Over time, the body experiences this as depletion without cause. What is happening beneath the surface is simple, but rarely articulated. When you feed fear, you are investing energy into a version of reality that is not currently taking shape. You are propping up a potential future that exists only as a mental construct. The mind treats that construct as real because energy is flowing into it, but reality does not respond in the same way. Reality responds to coherence, not rehearsal. Flow operates on a different principle. Flow does not ask you to imagine outcomes. It responds to what is already aligned in the present moment. When something is forming naturally, very little effort is required to participate in it. Decisions feel simpler, movements feel cleaner. Energy is conserved because you are no longer trying to override existing momentum. This difference is subtle but decisive. Fear requires constant input to remain convincing. It must be fed repeatedly through thought, attention, and emotional engagement. Flow does not require maintenance. It persists even when you are not thinking about it. That alone tells you something important about which one is real. The mind often resists this realization because it equates effort with responsibility. It assumes that if you are not actively managing outcomes, something will go wrong. But what usually goes wrong is not the future. What goes wrong is energy allocation. When energy is diverted into maintaining imagined timelines, there is less available to respond to what is actually emerging. This is why people often say they feel stuck while simultaneously feeling exhausted. They are spending energy, but nothing is moving. The energy is trapped in internal simulation. The body feels the expenditure. The world does not register it. Over time, this creates a sense of futility that is often misinterpreted as personal failure rather than misdirected investment. Flow, by contrast, does not feel urgent. It does not create pressure. It does not demand constant attention. It tends to reveal itself through small signals rather than dramatic impulses. Because it does not shout, it is easy to overlook. But its defining feature is efficiency. When you follow flow, energy is amplified rather than drained. Effort produces disproportionate movement because it aligns with existing structure. This is where many people become confused. They expect the correct path to feel intense, decisive, and emotionally charged. When it feels neutral or understated, they assume it cannot be meaningful. Fear fills the gap, offering intensity where flow offers simplicity. Intensity is mistaken for importance. Quiet alignment is mistaken for absence. What matters here is not how something feels emotionally, but how it behaves energetically. Does it require constant reassurance to stay alive? Does it collapse when you stop thinking about it? Does it generate movement in the world or only activity in the mind? These questions reveal whether energy is being invested into something that is forming or something that exists only as possibility. When you stop feeding fear, something unexpected happens. It does not immediately disappear, but it loses momentum. Without continuous attention, it cannot sustain its narrative. The imagined futures lose detail, the urgency softens, the body begins to settle because it is no longer being asked to prepare for events that have no immediate arrival time. At the same time, flow becomes easier to detect because there is less interference. You begin to notice where actions feel cleaner, where timing feels natural, where resistance decreases rather than increases. These signals were present before, but they were drowned out by mental noise. This shift does not require trust in the emotional sense. It requires accuracy. It requires recognizing that energy spent on what is not forming is energy wasted, regardless of how convincing the fear feels. Reality does not reward vigilance toward imagined outcomes. It responds to engagement with what is already coherent. There is also an important identity implication here. When you continue to feed fear, you keep an old version of yourself operational. That version believes it must manage the future to remain relevant. It equates control with safety. Withdrawing energy from fear is not just a practical decision, it is an identity update. It signals that the role of constant anticipator is no longer required. This can feel disorienting at first. Without fear organizing your attention, there may be moments of quiet when nothing seems to demand action. The mind may interpret this as emptiness or stagnation. In reality, it is a recalibration. Energy is returning to baseline. Space is opening for something else to register. Flow does not rush into that space. It does not need to. It waits until energy is no longer being siphoned off into unreal constructions. When that happens, movement begins with very little effort. Decisions become obvious rather than debated. Actions arise from clarity rather than pressure. This is the practical reason to trust flow more than fear. Fear consumes energy to maintain relevance. Flow conserves energy because it follows reality's existing direction. One requires constant management, the other unfolds through participation. As this distinction becomes clearer, a deeper question begins to surface. If fear has been absorbing energy by keeping attention locked on imagined futures, what actually happens when that energy is released? Where does it go? And how does flow signal itself once it no longer has to compete for attention? Once energy is no longer being consumed by imagined futures, something subtle becomes noticeable. Not dramatic, not emotional, not accompanied by certainty or excitement. It appears as a shift in texture rather than content. The internal noise reduces, the constant background tension softens, there is more space between thoughts. This is signal clarity returning. Flow does not announce itself the way fear does. It does not generate urgency. It does not argue its case. It does not need to be believed in to function. Flow operates quietly because it is not attempting to preserve anything. It does not defend identity. It does not maintain narrative continuity. It simply expresses alignment between your internal state and the direction reality is already moving. This is why flow is often overlooked. The mind is conditioned to notice intensity. It assumes that what matters will feel compelling, emotional, or decisive. When something arrives without pressure, it is often dismissed as insignificant. But flow is not designed to impress you. It is designed to move you efficiently. Flow signals through reduction rather than addition. It shows up as fewer internal objections, not more motivation. It shows up as less friction, not heightened enthusiasm. It often feels anticlimactic to the part of the mind that expects transformation to feel like a breakthrough. In reality, flow feels ordinary precisely because it is natural. One of the clearest indicators of flow is the absence of negotiation. When you are aligned with something that is forming, you do not need to convince yourself to engage with it. You also do not need to justify to anyone else. The movement feels self-evident, not exciting, not frightening, simply appropriate. This is deeply uncomfortable for an identity that equates importance with emotional charge. That identity expects resistance to mean significance and ease to mean triviality. But ease is not a lack of depth, it is a lack of obstruction. Flow moves through what does not resist it. Another signal of flow is timing that feels unforced. Actions arise at moments that make sense without requiring explanation. Opportunities appear when you are available rather than when you are desperate. Conversations unfold without rehearsal. Decisions land without prolonged internal debate. None of this feels miraculous, feels strangely obvious after the fact. The mind often tries to override these signals by asking for certainty. It wants guarantees, labels, future projections. Flow does not provide these. It operates one step at a time. It reveals the next movement, not the entire path. This frustrates a mind accustomed to planning far ahead, but it preserves energy by preventing overinvestment in outcomes that have not yet formed. Flow also communicates through bodily ease, not pleasure, not excitement, but a sense that the body is not bracing. Breathing is less shallow, muscles are less tense. There is less urgency to escape the present moment. These are not emotional highs, they are indicators that the nervous system is no longer preparing for an imagined threat. This is why trusting flow can feel unsettling at first. Without fear providing constant stimulation, there may be a sense of quiet that feels unfamiliar. The mind may label this as boredom or stagnation, but boredom is not the absence of meaning. It is the absence of unnecessary engagement. It is what remains when stimulation drops and signal becomes subtle. Flow also reveals itself through what stops happening. You stop forcing conversations. You stop chasing explanations. You stop rehearsing how things should unfold. The absence of compulsion is itself a message. When something is aligned, it does not require persuasion or pressure to continue. There is an important distinction to make here. Flow is not passivity. It does not mean doing nothing. It means responding rather than initiating from fear. Action still occurs, sometimes decisively, but it arises from clarity rather than anxiety. The energy behind it is different. It is clean. It does not leave residue. When action comes from fear, there is often an aftertaste of doubt or exhaustion. When action comes from flow, there is a sense of completion, even if the outcome is uncertain. The body registers that energy was used appropriately. This is not emotional satisfaction, it is energetic integrity. Flow does not require you to abandon discernment. It requires you to stop confusing noise with importance. The loudest signal is rarely the most accurate. The clearest signal often arrives without emotional decoration. It feels simple because it is not compensating for internal conflict. This is why people often say they missed the signs in hindsight. The signs were present, but they did not match the expected format. They did not arrive as dramatic impulses or intense desires. They arrived as quiet permissions, as openings rather than pushes, as moments where resistance simply was not there. When fear dominates attention, these signals are easy to miss. Fear fills space. It demands engagement. Flow waits. It does not compete. It remains available without insisting on being chosen. This does not make it weak. It makes it stable. As you become more familiar with this difference, trust stops being an emotional act and becomes a perceptual one. You begin to recognize flow by how little it asks of you internally. You notice that following it does not require constant reassurance. You do not need to talk yourself into it. You simply move. This is not about learning to hear flow. It is about learning to stop drowning it out. Once fear no longer consumes attention by projecting futures, the present becomes intelligible again. Signals become easier to read because there is less interference. In this space, a new challenge emerges. Without fear organizing attention, the old identity loses its primary function. There is no longer a role for constant anticipation or control. Something else is required now, something quieter, something less effortful. And that transition brings its own resistance. There is a moment that arrives quietly, often without announcement, when you realize that fear no longer needs to be answered, not solved, not reassured, not negotiated with, simply unanswered. This moment is subtle, and because it does not come with emotional fireworks, it is easy to overlook. Yet it marks a genuine internal shift. Something that once demanded constant engagement has begun to lose its grip. The part of you that generated fear around the future did so for a reason. It existed to maintain continuity. It kept you oriented, prepared, vigilant. It anticipated outcomes, scanned for risk, and attempted to keep life predictable enough to manage. For a long time, that role was necessary. It helped you function. It helped you survive. It helped you make sense of uncertainty when uncertainty felt dangerous. But roles do not retire themselves. They continue operating until they are no longer fed. The old self does not step aside because it understands that its work is complete. It steps aside when the energy that sustained it is withdrawn. Fear fades not because it is defeated, but because it is no longer required to organize your attention. When you stop responding to fear, something interesting happens. At first, it may try harder. The mind may offer sharper scenarios, more persuasive arguments, more vivid images of what could go wrong. This is a sign that a familiar structure is testing whether it still holds influence. Attention has been its currency. Without it, the system destabilizes. This is where many people give up. They interpret the spike as confirmation that the fear was right all along. They return to analysis. They seek reassurance. They re-engage. And in doing so, they breathe life back into an identity that was already weakening. The loop continues not because it is true, but because it is familiar. What allows the loop to break is recognition. Recognition that fear persists through engagement. Recognition that every time you argue with it, you confirm its relevance. Recognition that not responding is not avoidance, but a refusal to invest in something that no longer reflects your current reality. As this recognition deepens, a different experience begins to emerge. There are moments of quiet where nothing demands immediate interpretation. The mind may feel idle, the body may feel unoccupied. This can feel unsettling at first, especially if fear has been the primary driver of decision-making for a long time. The absence of pressure can feel like a lack of direction, but this space is not empty, it is unclaimed. It is the space where a new way of orienting can begin to form. The old self required constant engagement because it was built around anticipation. The new orientation does not need to anticipate. It responds, it waits for what is actually present before mobilizing energy. This is where trust takes on a different meaning. It is no longer about believing that things will work out. It is about recognizing that you do not need to maintain vigilance toward imagined futures in order to participate in what is real. Trust becomes an energy decision rather than an emotional stance. The old self often resists this shift because it interprets non-engagement as irresponsibility. It equates control with care. Letting go of fear feels to that identity like abandoning duty. But care does not require constant rehearsal of worst-case scenarios. Responsibility does not require exhaustion. Those were strategies suited to an earlier phase, not necessities of the present one. As fear loses influence, you may notice changes in how you relate to time. The future feels less pressing, the present feels less crowded. Decisions arise closer to the moment they are needed. This does not mean you become reckless or unprepared. It means preparation becomes proportionate rather than speculative. You may also notice a shift in how you experience yourself. Without fear defining your edges, identity becomes less rigid. You are no longer organizing around what must be prevented. You begin to organize around what is naturally emerging. This can feel unfamiliar, even vulnerable, because it lacks the armor of constant anticipation. The old self often tries to reassert itself at this stage by framing uncertainty as loss. It may suggest that without fear, you will miss something important, that you will fail to foresee consequences, that you will regret not having prepared more. These thoughts are echoes of a system that equated relevance with vigilance. They do not reflect current necessity. As you remain disengaged, these echoes lose coherence. They appear, but they no longer dominate. They do not organize behavior, they pass through rather than anchoring attention. This is not suppression, it is disinvestment. What begins to take their place is not excitement or certainty, but responsiveness. You become more available to what is actually happening. You notice opportunities without hunting for them. You respond to needs without dramatizing them. Energy moves where it is required rather than where it is imagined. This is the point where many people realize that fear was never the source of their momentum. It was the source of their tension. Movement now comes from a quieter place. It may feel slower at first because it is not fueled by urgency, but it is steadier. It does not burn out. It does not require recovery. The old self does not disappear completely. It simply stops running the system. It becomes contextual rather than central. It may still activate in situations that genuinely require anticipation or caution, but it no longer dominates everyday orientation. Its role becomes specific rather than total. This transition does not happen all at once. It unfolds through repeated non-engagement. Each time fear is not fed, the system recalibrates. Each time energy is withheld from imagined futures, it becomes more available for what is actually forming. Over time, this becomes the new normal. At this stage, the question is no longer whether you can let go of fear. The question becomes whether you can recognize what is asking for your energy now that fear is no longer consuming it. Something is beginning to take shape in the absence of noise, something that does not need to convince you of its importance. That is where this journey resolves. By now, something important should feel clear, even if it has not been framed as a conclusion. Fear has not been the enemy in this process. It has been a signal that outlived its original function. It rose to prominence when uncertainty required constant anticipation, and it stayed active because it continued to receive energy. What you have seen across this transmission is that fear does not dissolve through confrontation. It dissolves through irrelevance. Trusting the flow is not a leap of faith. It is a practical decision about where energy is most accurately placed. Fear pulls energy toward imagined futures that cannot yet respond. Flow receives energy and converts it into movement because it follows what is already assembling. One drains, the other organizes. At a certain point, continuing to listen to fear becomes inefficient. It asks for constant attention while offering no clear return. It keeps you oriented toward what might happen instead of what is happening. Flow, on the other hand, does not ask you to abandon discernment. It asks you to stop rehearsing realities that are not forming. This is where trust becomes grounded rather than emotional. You are not being asked to feel confident. You are being asked to be accurate. Accurate about what requires your energy now. Accurate about what no longer needs to be managed. Accurate about the difference between present moment signals and future-based noise. The quiet clarity that follows is not dramatic. It does not announce a new chapter. It does not provide a map. It simply removes unnecessary interference. Without fear constantly projecting forward, the present becomes readable again. You notice timing. You notice ease. You notice where resistance drops away without explanation. These are not mystical signs. They are indicators of alignment. As you step into this orientation, something stabilizes internally. Decisions no longer feel like gambles. They feel proportional. You act when action is needed. You wait when waiting is appropriate. You stop trying to force certainty where none is required. This does not make life predictable. It makes it responsive. The most important realization here is that flow does not need to be trusted in advance. It only needs to be recognized. It has been operating the entire time, quietly beneath the noise. What changes is not the presence of flow, but your willingness to stop diverting energy away from it. Fear may still appear from time to time. That does not mean you have failed or regressed. It simply means an old reflex has been triggered. You now know how to place it correctly. You know whether it is asking you to protect your body in the present moment, or whether it is asking you to protect an identity that no longer defines you. That distinction alone prevents countless unnecessary detours. As this integration settles, trust becomes less about belief and more about consistency. Each time you choose not to engage with imagined futures, energy returns to the present. Each time you respond to what is actually forming, movement becomes easier. Over time, this reshapes how you experience yourself. You are no longer organized around anticipation. You are organized around participation. This is not a dramatic ending, it is a stabilization, a return of energy to where it belongs, a recognition that you do not need to manage what is not real in order to move forward. You need only to notice what is real and respond accordingly. Before you leave this transmission, I want to anchor this orientation in a simple, memorable way, as a clear statement of where your energy is going to live. Take a moment after this video ends and write this sentence exactly as it is. I trust flow more than fear. Write it once. Write it cleanly. Let it stand without explanation. That sentence is not about suppressing fear. It is about choosing accuracy over noise. It is about withdrawing energy from what no longer needs it and allowing movement to occur where structure already exists. And when you find yourself at the edge of uncertainty again, as you inevitably will, return to that sentence. Not to convince yourself, but to remind yourself where your energy belongs. I trust flow more than fear.